Good evening. It's a pleasure to be back here in Edutola after yesterday's session. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing Gurucharan Das, with whom I will be having a conversation about his latest book, Kama, the Riddle of Desire. Gurucharan Das is an author and a public intellectual, best known for a much acclaimed trilogy on the classical Indian goals of life. India Unbound was the first on Artha, which offered a personal account of India's recent social and economic rise. The difficulty of being good on dharma or moral well-being illuminates our day-to-day moral dilemmas through a meditation on the epic Mahabharata. And the third book, the third part of this trilogy, Kama, the Riddle of Desire, on the third goal teaches us how to cherish desire in order to have a rich and flourishing life. Gurucharan Das was the CEO of Procter & Gamble India. And at 50, he did something very counterintuitive after reaching such a high position. He took early retirement to become a full-time writer. He has written extensively on business and related subjects. And he contributes regularly to the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. And he has written other books such as India Grows at Night, a liberal case for a strong state, which was on the Financial Times best books for 2013. And he has written a few other books as well. He is known for a very refreshing independence of thought, bringing a very different flavor to all the subjects he addresses, backed by impressive scholarship and a lot of authoritative and authentic research. So without much ado, let me go into the discussion. And I will start by asking Gurucharan about the title of the book. It's Kama, the Riddle of Desire. So there are two aspects, there are two elements there, and I will ask him to talk separately about both. First is to explain to us Kama, what is meant by Kama, because I think this is a very loaded term, and we all think we understand it. And the second part of it, which I will ask him to come to after he addresses that, is why is it a riddle? Why did he introduce the term riddle in the very title itself? So over to you, Gurucharan.
Well, Kama simply means desire. But unlike the English word desire, it also means the pleasure, the consequence of desire. And so it means both. And India is perhaps the only civilization in the world that elevated desire to a goal of life. It was a source of happiness. And I used to have a very simple one-line definition of happiness, which was to love your work and love the person you live with. All this definition stood me good for a long time until I discovered the classical Purusharthas in the old ancient tradition. And that was the notion of the four goals, which was Artha. And so as you mentioned, I've already written a book, India Unbound, on Artha. And second goal of life is Dharma, which is moral well-being. Artha is material well-being. And the third is Kama, which means emotional or sexual well-being. And as I said, it is, it's quite extraordinary that in most cultures, for example, in the Western tradition, I think there's a conversation going on the first row, and I can't seem to be able to, if you prefer, you know, you can have the conversation elsewhere. Sorry? You're trying to say something to me? Anyway, let's come back. So I was explaining in the Western tradition, desire is associated with original sin, with guilt and shame. And here was a culture where in the beginning, in the Christian tradition, in the beginning was light. God said, let there be light. In the Rig Veda, in the beginning was desire, and the cosmos was created from the seed of desire in the mind of the One. And thus, I was trying to explain to you that here, why did they elevate it? Why did they elevate desire to a goal of life? And the reason is that they realized that karma is the source of all action. If we didn't desire, we wouldn't wake up in the morning. Karma is, as I just explained, is the source of creation of the cosmos. Karma is the source of procreation. And so, really, the living cell is living because of karma. And so they realized very early that it was a very important part of human life.
Can I butt in here just at this stage, Gurucharan? You have explained to us very briefly what karma is and why in the Purusharthas its place. I'm curious about your use of the term, riddle. Why is it? Why do you use the term the riddle of desire?
Well, I'll just explain. My book actually is the biography of an emotion, and so it's written in the form of a fictional memoir. It's a story. I don't think you can write about desire without a story. And so, frankly, I just wanted to, just before we come to the riddle, I wanted to show this. I don't know whether you can see this. Shall I hold it? Yeah, can you see this beautiful cover? And I wanted to explain there are 5 flowers. And when Indians elevated karma, sorry?
No, there's another.
Somebody's.
No, there's another venue behind.
He's talking to you.
No, it's not. It's another mic. It's another venue.
Oh, okay. Anyway. So what we were saying is the flowers. That karma also was a god. And this god shoots arrows at his victims. And so there are 5 stages of desire. And the 5 stages, the first stage is when the 2 people meet. And this is the flower that karma shoots, which is the white jasmine flower. And this is when the 2 people meet, and this is when they decide to do something about it. I think we have another.
No, that's unfortunately, that's just on the other side. Can we have that mic brought down a bit, please? It's very distracting.
Yeah.
Can we have the other mic brought down?
Anyway, we'll try to think of it as nice background music to this session. And so I was saying, this is when Ashoka flower, when the two people decide to do something about it. And this is the third stage of desire, when there is intimacy. And intimacy is often and usually connected with marriage and with having children, and then the hard work of bringing up children. The fact is that as decades go by, the desire wanes. Desire wanes, and what you have is the fourth stage of desire. And that's the challenge for all of us. That how do you keep desire alive? How do you keep love alive in a relationship? And so that you don't get to the fifth stage, which is the sandalwood flower called maran. So when desire dies. And so in a sense, this book is an attempt to understand desire through these different stages. And the riddle of desire that you talked about, there are many riddles of desire in the book, but the one that I want to talk about is the one at the fourth stage. So, the main character, his name is Amar. He's happily married. He loves his wife, he loves his two daughters, and for all practical purposes, it's an excellent life, except that he's in middle age, in his 40s, and desire has waned in his life. And so he has to go one day to work and to go to Pune. And he lives in Bombay. And some of you who may know Bombay, you have to go to VT station and catch the Deccan Queen to go to Bombay. And that's what he does. You know, that music is a bit loud. I don't know what we can do about it. Is it disturbing you? Or no, you're fine.
Okay.
Okay, lovely. So, he's in the Deccan Queen, and soon comes a beautiful stranger who sits near him on the train, and like polite people, polite passengers, they engage in impersonal conversation about the weather, etc. But soon that conversation, there's obviously some chemistry between them, and the conversation becomes, something is going on here.
No, please.
Yeah. No. Can you please
lower
request
that volume?
that sound of that such?
Okay, thank you. He's just got it. They've lowered it a bit.
They are loading it. Okay, thank you. I think you were able to, you very heroically were bearing with it. I was having a little harder time trying to compete. Anyway, so here's this beautiful stranger. The talk begins impersonal, then it gets more and more personal because there's chemistry, and by the end of the journey, there is what we sometimes think of as a kind of electricity between two people. And it's clear to both of them that they are very attracted to each other, and they may have an affair. So when they get off the train in Pune station, they get off and they go their separate ways. But this woman still stays in his head, and as the days go by, he wonders whether to give her a call. And he asks himself, what if we had an affair? He's thinking to himself, what would be the consequence? Well, immediately he says, the consequence will be that my marriage will break. I will hurt the person I love the most, which is my wife. And so he says, no, I don't think it's a good idea to have an affair. Then another few weeks go by, and she still won't get out of his mind. And he says to himself, well, maybe we could keep the affair a secret, and then nobody would find out. But then he thinks that if he keeps it secret, he'll have to lie. And lies will have to be piled upon more lies. And pretty soon, he'll become an inauthentic human being. And he doesn't want to be that either. So he again gives up the idea of having an affair. And then another few weeks go by, and he says, she still won't go out of his mind. And he says, now, what will be the consequence of not having an affair? And the consequence, he realizes, will be that as he's beginning to grow, he may grow more and more resentful with himself, with his family, and he may end up becoming eventually a mean, old, shriveled man. And that's also not what he wants to be. And so this choice is whether to betray himself or to betray his wife. Now we are always, so in other words, this is a conflict between dharma, our duty to others, and karma, our duty to ourselves. Normally, we are told every day about our duties to others, but we never think that we have a duty to ourselves. And so this book makes us think about the costs of our decisions. And so this is one of the riddles. And the question, he's quite, as you know, I mean, he doesn't know what to do. And frankly, there is no answer. This is one of those dilemmas in life where there is no answer. I wrote The Difficulty of Being Good, where I talked about a lot of other dilemmas of dharma. But here's another dilemma where there is no answer. And this is why Mahabharata called karma the melancholic human condition. And he asks himself, you know, why do we make such a big deal about desire and sex? Why can't it be like something, the way the natural world, the animals think of sex? You know, there's no lot of emotion, there's not the kind of emotional bang associated with it. And why can't it be like a game of tennis? And one can go to the club in the evening, play tennis from 5 to 7 or whatever. And the reason is this. The reason is that we are different from animals. And in one respect, in many respects, but in one respect, we are different because we have the ability, we have an imagination. And when we meet someone in that first stage of desire, we tend then to, it acts on our imagination. Our fantasy, we create a fantasy around that person. And after a while, only that person, is matters. Plato has a very interesting story where Plato talks about desire as a lack of something. And he says that actually human beings, one of the characters in the dialogue, Phaedo, talks about the fact that, well, we human beings were originally double the size that we are today, and the gods got worried because human beings became powerful, so they chopped us into two, and so the human being is looking for that one person, is looking for that other half of one person. Anyway, and from this idea, later romantic love is born in history.
Gurucharan, I just wanted to ask you to talk a bit about, you introduced some very interesting terms, karma, optimism, karma, pessimism, and
Right.
karma realism.
Yes.
Now, could you,
Yes.
because from this I think we come into trying to find a way forward in life
Yes.
with karma. Could you tell us something about that?
So really, the question in all our minds is, if in the past we were so open and we elevated karma to a god, to a goal of life, why have we become so prudish today? And why do we sweep it under the carpet whenever the subject comes up? And the fact is that we often blame the British, we blame the Victorians for this, and to some extent that's true. But the reality is that we always were ambivalent about karma. The fact of the matter is that karma was a problem to the renouncer. And as you know, the renouncer in our civilization was a huge, big hero. The Rishi, the Buddha, the ascetic. And for them, it was desire was a problem to their spiritual progress. And so their goal was celibacy. And so I call these people karma pessimists. And we had karma pessimists right through history. But we also had our karma optimists. Not only the ancients who elevated to a goal of life and created a god. In fact, reminds me that, before I forget, that when this book was launched in Delhi, on the panel with me discussing was Shashi Tharoor. And Shashi Tharoor made a very good suggestion. He said, let's change Valentine's Day to Kama Deva Divas. And we'll take all the steam out of the Hindutvas if we do that. But, so to come back to why we turned prudish, opposed to the karma pessimists were the optimists. And the optimists were the ones who created the god, etc. But also, when the courts came up and the kingdoms came up, in the courtly life, you had a lot of Sanskrit love poetry written in the Gupta period. And you also have the Kama Sutra written at that time. And the Kama Sutra, I think we all have a misconception. We think of Kama Sutra as a book of sexual positions. In fact, Kama Sutra is a book of manners. And in fact, Kama Sutra is the one to Amar's dilemma that I was talking about on the Deccan Queen to Pune. The fact that what the Kama Sutra says is that, look, every handsome man desires every attractive woman, and every attractive woman desires every handsome man. But after some consideration, the matter goes no further. Imagine the Kama Sutra saying that. But Kama Sutra has other advice that it gives us. It says, it's telling a man, this is from a man's perspective, the man is the Nagaraka, the man about town, who's the hero of the Kama Sutra. It's telling him that, look, if you want to be socially successful, don't talk about yourself. Talk about the other person. Talk about her. If you want to be socially successful, don't speak in Sanskrit. Talk in the language of the people. Otherwise, people will think, or she will think, you are pompous. And she'll run away. And then it gives the advice to the seducer that if you want to be successful, first think of her pleasure and then only think of your pleasure. Anyway, this was the tradition of the Kama optimists. But there was a compromise, a grand compromise made between the Kama optimists and the Kama pessimists. And that compromise was documented in the Dharma Shastras. And that basically said that sex is all right as long as it's within marriage. And that's what I call Kama realism. And every society basically has followed that idea of Kama realism.
Here, Gurucharan, I want you to come from this point where we are dealing with how Kama optimism, Kama pessimism, and then finally the grand compromise. So this is all about society. You mention elsewhere in the early stages of the book, you talk about India having gone through 3 liberations.
Yes, yes.
Could you tell us something about those 3 liberations and their significance?
Yes, I think that our first freedom was in 1947 when we got the British out and became politically free. Now, we didn't become economically free. We had to wait 40 years till 1991 reforms when we won our economic freedom. And we are still fighting for that freedom with the reforms because they are half complete. And India will not realize its true economic potential until we do those reforms as well. So the third, that was 47, one milestone. Second milestone is 1991. A third milestone is what I call emotional freedom. And that too is certainly not complete in any way, but enough events happened thanks to our Supreme Court towards the end of 2018 that we could think of it as a liberation. You think about, first was the judgment, the Triple Talaq judgment that liberated the Muslim women. The second judgment was a judgment against homosexuality that liberated 15% of our population, or most human populations, 15-20% is gay or is homosexual. And that was decriminalized. Then adultery was decriminalized as an offense. And then you could say that the controversial judgment on the Sabrimala temple, allowing freedom for half the population to go into any temple that they wished. And finally, I would say the Me Too movement. You know, here we are at a time when globalization is under threat around the world, and an idea was born about a year and a half ago in the United States called Me Too. And this idea now is in 130 countries, went viral. And India too had a very lively Me Too movement. So by 2000, I would say 2018, all these 5 things added up to kind of an emotional liberation for the country.
Yeah.
And you know, just one second. And I would say that it's important that to think that there's a story from the Mahabharata that illustrates exactly this emotional liberation. There's at one point Yudhishthira asks Bhishma, he says, who gets more pleasure from sex, a man or a woman? And Bhishma gets thinking, and he says, well, you've got to be a man and a woman to answer that question. And he says, oh yes, there was a king, Bhangashvana, who for half his life was a man, and then he obviously had a transgender change, and he became a woman for the second half of his life. And because he was a good person, he was told that now you can choose what you want to be in your next life, a man or a woman. And he unhesitatingly says, a woman. And people say, are you crazy? You could be an emperor. You've been a great king. And you want to be a woman? And he says, yes. And why? He says, for one thing, a woman gets greater pleasure from sex. But the second, more important reason is that the woman's emotional life is far richer than a man's emotional life. And he says, frankly, the life, that private life, is more important for human beings than the public life of a king or a prime minister or a CEO and all those things. And so it reminded his answer about the emotional life, reminded me of E.M. Foster's novel called 2 Cheers for Democracy. And why did people said, but why not 3 cheers for democracy? And he said, because I reserve 3 cheers only for the private life, for the emotional life. And so that is in the same vein as what we talked about.
Gurucharan, just one more. I just want to continue a little bit more on the 3 liberations which you spoke about. The first was the political freedom in 1947, then the economic freedom in 1991, and then the emotional freedoms which were brought about by a series of Supreme Court judgments. And you mentioned about the 3 categories of karma people, that is the karma pessimists, the karma optimists. You also, and the karma realists. And you also mentioned somewhere in the book about the, in fact, it comes through like a thread, there is an ambivalence in our tradition also towards karma.
Yes.
And I felt curious that in the judgment of the lordships of the Supreme Court judges, when they passed the orders in section 377 and the other sections, all the authorities and sources they cited were all Western sources.
Yes.
There was not a single citation from the Indian tradition. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think they were just ignorant. I mean, the Lord Justices were well educated in English, but they had not read Sanskrit. And luckily I have. And so I think this book is rich, partly because the narrator keeps stopping the story and telling us about different facets of desire. And so texts like the Gita Govinda, I think every Indian should read the Gita Govinda. And there is ambivalence for you. And it's interesting because, you know, romantic love was born around the 12th century around the world. And in fact, it was in the Western world, it was the iconic text is Tristan and Isolde. And then later you have all these troubadours, etc., going to Romeo and Juliet and other romantic plays of Shakespeare and so on. And the 19th century romantic novels. The same time in the 12th century, you have Nizami in the Islamic world who's writing about Laila Majnu. And that's a discovery of romantic love in the Islamic world. At the same time, 12th century, we have in India, specifically in eastern India, Bengal, Orissa, you have Gita Govinda. Now, why is it so important and why it answers your question? Because in India, romantic love took a very interesting turn towards the divine. That the realization that there was something sacred. I mean, we have a tradition of regarding the universe as sacred. But here, it is elevated to something sacred. And so, in fact, the story of Krishna and Radha is told very beautifully. I think it's one of the best renditions. And what you have here, of course, the Bhakti movement and Chaitanya and all these other Bhakti saints explained this desire as the soul's desire for the divine, the soul's yearning for the divine. But in Jayadeva's poem, it is also not only Radha's love for Krishna, and it's not only Krishna's sort of love for all mankind, but specifically it is love of a God for a single human being. And that single human being is married. So it's an adulterous love. I mean, he's really shaking us up. So a God feeling and having she's married. She has an adulterous love. And so I think that, I mean, you have to read the last stanza is often left out when it's not translated because it's very explicit. But do read it. And also the Kumara Sambhava, which is probably the best poem of conjugal love. And it's the love of Shiva and Parvati. Exquisitely, read Canto 8 of that. And Canto 8 was often not translated, by the way, even in the medieval texts in Marathi and in other Indian languages, because it's quite explicit of love of the. So that's, I think, partly the point that we are making.
Here, on a lighter note, and I'm sure you've probably been asked this question many times. You have explained why you adopted the fictional narrative form, because it enabled you to deal with a subject like karma in a far more convincing way, because you can make it the story of a person called Amar going through this. But when you look at the fact that Amar was from a Punjabi family and then they moved from Pakistan to Delhi, and then he grew up in Delhi and he took a corporate world, a job, and then he went to Bombay. So one can't help see a lot of parallels with your life. So is there a lot of Gurucharan Das in Amar, or vice versa?
Well, there's Gurucharan Das in every character in the book. And I might say this is the answer that Flaubert gave when they asked him how much of Madame Bovary was fictional and how much he was there. And he said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. It's me. And so it's really, every writer will tell you that, oh, this is a work of fiction, etc. But you can't help it. Even the greatest writers, and certainly I'm not up there, but I would say that there is a bit of one's life in every book one writes.
I think we have a few more minutes before we open up. I just want to ask you, see, one question. I think many of you who have read Gurucharan Das's books, I'm sure many of you would understand the very important role he has played and continues to play in shaping the emerging modernism in India.
Yeah.
India is undergoing a lot of transition, and his books, his thoughts, which he has expressed, right from India Unbound, India Grows at Night, to Difficulty of Being Good, and now this book. Yeah, and where it's about emotions, because we have to grow, we have to mature as a people and be modern in our outlook. So all this is there. So I was thinking about the fact, for instance, he continues to write also extensively in various prestigious publications. On 14th of January of this, just 2-3 days ago, in the Times of India, in the op-ed, he wrote his regular column, and the title was, "And Now the Good News." Now,
Finally the good news.
And finally the good news. And so while most intellectuals are prone to having a fairly despairing and dark view of the world as it emerges and feeling everything is going to the dogs and everything, he has a contrarian view, and in fact with a lot of data he supports that actually poverty is reducing, illness is reducing, suffering is reducing, violence is reducing, and there is an impressive amount of data on that. I would just like to ask Gurucharan to give a comment about this and this modernization, this transition which is happening in our country, painfully probably, but it's still happening.
Well, it's looking at the glass of water. You can look at it half full or half empty. That's your choice. There's always good things happening and bad things happening. And I don't want to suggest that I'm one of those Pollyanna sort of optimists who see everything and is unable to see the suffering and misery in the world. And so when I talk about the good news, I do think that there is, even in the case of karma, I would put myself on the optimist side of karma. And that's why even the whole dilemma that Amar faces, a lot of people would say, oh my God, what a terrible fellow, even to think of having an affair, And frankly, I think if you have, as a human being, if you haven't been tempted at least once in your life, you cannot be trusted. And so, my point is that, yes, that, I mean, there is a romantic love. I'm very careful to point out the downside of romantic love. The downside, and you know, we got romantic love through Bollywood, frankly, and India still remains the sort of last country where we still have arranged marriages. And a lot of people still ask, well, is that modern to have an arranged marriage these days? And I just want to tell you a little story, because an English friend of ours came and she took us to see Bridget Jones's Diary. Have you seen that movie, Bridget Jones's Diary? Well, see it. You can see it on Netflix or somewhere. Anyway, in that film, it's a story of a woman who is reached, I mean, the boy next door was never good enough for her. So she waited and waited for her Prince Charming, you know, the romantic man who will sweep her off her feet. And suddenly, she's in her mid-30s or late 30s, and she begins to panic. And but I want to have children. I want to have a family. And so that's what the film's all about. And this English girl said to me after the movie, she said that really this is the downside of romantic love, because we all think that there's a perfect soulmate. And that's why she said the Indian idea, she says, I think we should, export this idea back to England and to the West, because it's so much more sensible, according to brought up the children. And you were not expected to have a romantic lover in your wife. You were not expected to have a woman who's great in sex in your wife. I mean, we were much more relaxed about these roles and so on. But now, the pressure on a woman, she has to be perfect. You know, she not only has to be a mother to our children, she has to run the house, she has to be great in bed, she has to be a romantic person, and plus she has to go out and work. I mean, imagine the pressure you're putting on a modern woman. You talked about modernity, and that's a problem, of course, that we are all facing here.
Thank you, Gurucharan. Now, I think we have got about 15 minutes left, and so I'd like to open up I'm sure this, on a subject like this, and with having heard Gurucharan speak up and say so many interesting and provocative thoughts and ideas, now it's over to you to ask questions. Please keep the questions short. Say your name. Please, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, wonderful session. I attended one of your sessions back in Jaipur Literature Festival too. And that thing you said about either you cheat yourself or you cheat your partner, it has stayed with me. Am I audible? Yeah. So my question is that, is it safe to assume that Is it safe to assume that you at your age talk about optimist karma? Is it safe to assume that at some stage my grandparents too thought of sex in that manner? And whether or not it is okay to be a karma optimist in this day and age, and what are the arguments for being a karma optimist rather than a realist or a pessimist?
Okay, the first part of what you said I missed. Can you repeat that?
So at your age, you talk about karma optimism. Is it safe to assume that my grandparents too used to think about it that way, and at what stage did they, lose that vision of karma optimism?
Well, I think it's a way of looking at the world. You can be 17 and you can be worried about buying insurance for your old age. In fact, when I was running Procter and Gamble, I interviewed a young man, and he was 21 years old. And after the interview, I asked him, well, do you have any question? And he said, what's your retirement plan? And I said, I think this guy is not an optimist. His guy is not going to take risks in his life. So it's a way of looking at the world. And while we are thinking about that, I was going to tell you about the very last lines of this book. The very last lines of this book are a short few lines from the poet, the medieval erotic poet Bilhana. And Bilhana wrote beautiful love poetry. And he also was the teacher of a princess who fell in love with him. And he fell in love with her. And the king found out. And the king said, now you'll be beheaded. And so, as he's going to his death, he's walking, and his head is going to be chopped off. What is he thinking? And this is what he is thinking. And it comes in Sanskrit from the word smara. Smara, kama is desire, but smara is the memory of desire. And so it is his smara that he talks about. And if you'll indulge me for 1
I'll hold the
minute.
mic.
Yeah, just hold this. It's just the very last line of the book. So, I'm quoting, before dying, Smara comes to his rescue, and he remembers his beloved's beauty, and he brings her alive with his smriti. The word smriti also comes from Smara, the capacity for remembrance. So this is what he says. Even now, I remember her eyes, restlessly closed after love, her slender body limp, fine clothes and heavy hair loose. I shall recall her in my next life and even at the end of time.
Good evening, sir. I'm afraid I haven't read your books, but I have read the reviews on your books in newspapers. You mentioned Supreme Court orders and making emotional liberation effective last year. I just want to refer legalizing extramarital relations, adultery, legalizing adultery. And in fact, I was also thought, as moderator mentioned, they were inspired by Western views. But you say Indian scriptures support it. We have, in India, we have one of the best family system in the world, they say.
Yeah.
How you correlate this?
Yes, how do you reconcile?
One more question, sir. One more question. What about the emotion of children?
Yes.
Unlike other living beings,
Yes.
Human children, they need support from their parents.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I would like to know your views on this. Thank you.
Yes. And this is actually a very important theme of this book. because I won't tell you what Amar decides to do. When you read the book, you will understand what decision he takes and what happens to his life. And you're absolutely right that the Indian, we had our optimists and we had our pessimists and we had our realists. The realists are the ones who wrote the Dharma Shastras. And I'm not referring only to the Manava Dharma Shastra, Manu, because that's a somewhat pessimistic Dharma Shastra. But the others, and certainly you're absolutely right that the tradition in India is, you know, it's in the West, the sort of stereotype that we have is of the American husband who comes home one day and tells his wife, honey, I've fallen out of love with you, let's get a divorce. So I think in our tradition, yes, there are stages of life. We go through different levels. I mean, that's why all the different flowers that the god Kama throws at us. But there's a wisdom in our tradition which says that desire changes at every decade of your life. And one of the requirements of the happy life, of the good life, is your ability to convert that desire into something alive and not let it die. And so I'm not saying I'm against divorce or anything. I think that's something that two people have to decide. And there's nothing in our tradition also against divorce. But certainly the wisdom of tradition in talking about these stages of desire is to make you realize that there is creativity involved, that to keep a relationship alive, requires effort, creativity, and some people do it and some don't.
Anybody? Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Do you think the idea of marriage is something which is the root cause of all problems, wherein one is faced with the moral dilemma of cheating one's partner or not? And if there is no marriage, one would be able to attain karma, one goal of life, more easily if there is no marriage.
Well, you know, there's another story in the Mahabharata, which I must tell you. It's a famous story, and the main character of the story is Shvetaketu. Now, you may remember Shvetaketu is a hero in one of the Upanishads. And Shvetaketu is a young man, and he sees his mother go out with a different man every night. And the first day he sees she goes out, and she comes back in the morning. And finally, on the third day, he looks at his father, and he tells his father, doesn't it bother you that your wife goes out at night like this? And his father explains to him, to his son, that look, human beings are polygamous by nature. So we are talking about the state of nature now. And the Mahabharata, quite supported by science now, that we were polygamous. And so Shvetaketu grows up and becomes a lawmaker. And he decrees that there will be monogamy. And that's the origin, according to the Mahabharata, of marriage. That marriage begins, and then, as you say, the problems begin.
Do you have Any more questions? Any more ladies in the audience? Have interesting. Any ladies in the audience have some interesting questions? Difficult questions for Gurucharan to try to answer? Or men, for that matter?
Did I answer your second question, sir? Yeah, what was your second question? I think he needs a mic.
Something about children.
My second question was, unlike other beings, human children of human being, they need some
Yes.
support from
Yes,
parents.
yes.
Uh,
So
wha-
that's really related to the whole notion of the family and why partly for the sake of the children, that tradition, the Dharma Shastras came to this compromise that I spoke about. But I think in the dilemma that the riddle that Amar faces, do you remember? I was telling you, he's thinking of his wife. He also, because he loves his children, he also thinks about the fact that his children will get hurt if he has an affair. And so his logic is, yes, the children will get hurt, but he feels that the overwhelming consideration for him is his wife. That's the big one. He says the children will grow up and go away. And of course he says, I can't say openly to them that I ignored you, because then they will remind me all my life about it. But that's kind of the way that it tackles in this story.
I think we have time for one more question. One last question, anybody?
Okay,
Okay.
I think we have come to the end. It's 59 minutes past.
So
with
anyway,
1 minute
it
to
just
spare.
remains for me to thank Gurucharan for coming down and spending time explaining in his very distinctively refreshing and frank manner, dealing with a subject which, let's face it, we Indians are not normally very comfortable talking about, even within our homes, let alone in an open forum like this. And this is one of the prices we must pay for modernity, for modernizing. There's no escaping it. Many subjects like this will have to be discussed by us in open fora, and we must work out. There is no answer, no easy answer in all these cases, but we must. So once again, thank you so much, Gurucharan.
Thank you so much.